The town looked like it had been forgotten by the world, silent, decayed, and waiting. The rusted street signs swayed gently in the wind, creaking like ancient tombstones whispering to one another. The clouds hung low, casting a sickly grey hue over the buildings, making the air thick with dread. Sarah could feel the unease crawling up her spine, the quiet suffocating her senses as she stood on the edge of the main street, wondering why she had ever agreed to come here. Her friend, Ethan, had been relentless about visiting the ghost town. It was supposed to be an adventure, a harmless exploration of an abandoned place with a dark past. But now, as Sarah stared down the empty street, she realized this was no ordinary ghost town. It felt alive in its desolation. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice a shaky whisper. Ethan, holding a camera in one hand and grinning like a kid on Christmas morning, turned to her. "Come on, Sarah. It's just a town. What's the worst that could happen?" They had driven for hours, following the faded directions Ethan had found online. The town didn't appear on any modern maps, and that only added to its appeal for Ethan. According to local legends, the place had been abandoned overnight decades ago, though no one could agree on why. Some said there had been a disease, others claimed it was a curse. All Sarah knew was that the moment they had crossed the invisible threshold into the town, something felt wrong. The air had changed. It was colder, heavier, as if the town was pulling them in. The first building they encountered was a gas station, its pumps long dry, the windows shattered. As they passed by, Sarah thought she saw movement inside, but when she looked again, there was nothing. Her heart began to race, a deep, primal fear settling in her gut. "Do you feel that?" she asked, hoping Ethan would share her unease. Ethan laughed. "It's just your imagination. This place is supposed to feel creepy. That's the point." Sarah nodded, but her eyes darted around nervously. Every corner of the town seemed to hold a secret, waiting to be revealed. The wind carried faint whispers, and she swore she could hear footsteps that weren't their own. The main street was lined with abandoned shops, dust-covered windows displaying remnants of a life long gone. A diner, its neon sign flickering intermittently, stood at the corner. Sarah stared at it, her eyes narrowing. "Did you see that?" she asked. "See what?" "The lights. They flickered." "It's just old wiring," Ethan replied, brushing off her concern. "Let's check it out. Maybe we'll find something cool." Reluctantly, Sarah followed him into the diner. The door creaked open, and a musty smell hit them, like the air had been trapped inside for decades. Inside, everything was eerily preserved. Tables were set with plates of food, long rotten and mouldy, as if the patrons had vanished mid-meal. The ticking of a clock echoed through the silence. "Creepy," Ethan muttered, pulling out his camera to document the scene. Sarah's eyes scanned the room, her breath catching in her throat when she noticed something strange. "Ethan, the food. It's fresh." "What?" he asked, not looking up from his camera. "The food. It's fresh," she repeated, her voice shaking. Ethan glanced over, frowning. "It's just your imagination. This place has been abandoned for years." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The smell of the food was faint but unmistakable, like it had just been cooked. Her stomach churned, and she backed away, her heart racing. They left the diner quickly, but the unease followed them like a shadow. Every building they passed seemed to watch them, and the streets, once empty, now felt alive with unseen eyes. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every now and then, she would hear the faintest of footsteps behind them, but when she turned, there was no one there. "I don't like this," she whispered. Ethan, still caught up in the excitement of exploring, waved her off. "We've barely scratched the surface. Don't chicken out on me now." But as they ventured deeper into the town, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The sky darkened, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter, distant and distorted. Sarah froze, grabbing Ethan's arm. "Did you hear that?" He stopped, listening. The wind howled, but underneath it there was something else. Laughter, high-pitched, childlike, and utterly wrong. It echoed down the street, growing louder and closer. "Let's go," Sarah said, pulling on Ethan's arm. Ethan hesitated, but the laughter was unmistakable now. It sounded like children playing, their voices distorted by the wind. It sent chills down Sarah's spine. They started to walk faster, but the laughter followed them, surrounding them from all sides. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. Where were the voices coming from? The town was supposed to be abandoned. They rounded a corner, and suddenly the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's legs felt like jelly as they stopped in front of an old schoolhouse. The windows were boarded up, and the building seemed to loom over them, casting a long shadow. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered. Ethan didn't respond. He was staring at something ahead. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. In the middle of the street, standing perfectly still, was a little girl. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white dress, her long hair covering her face. "Ethan," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to go." But Ethan was transfixed. "It's just a kid," he said, stepping forward. "No," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "Something's wrong." The girl didn't move. She stood there, her head slightly tilted, as if listening to something only she could hear. And then, without warning, she turned and walked into the schoolhouse. Sarah's blood ran cold. "We're leaving. Now." Ethan hesitated, but finally nodded. "Yeah. Okay." They turned and hurried back the way they came, but the town seemed different now. The streets twisted and turned in ways they hadn't before, the buildings leaning in as if to trap them. The laughter returned, louder and more distorted, echoing in their ears as they ran. As they raced through the winding streets, Sarah's mind spun with fear. It was as if the town itself was alive, shifting and reshaping to confuse them. Every corner they turned seemed to lead them deeper into the maze of decaying buildings and twisted alleys. The laughter, once distant, now seemed to come from every direction, taunting them. "We need to find the car," Sarah gasped, her breath coming in short bursts. "We need to get out of here." Ethan nodded, but his face had lost its earlier excitement. Now, he looked just as terrified as Sarah felt. They ran through the narrow streets, their footsteps echoing eerily off the crumbling walls. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, twisting into strange shapes that danced just beyond the edge of their vision. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. They skidded to a halt, panting and sweating, their eyes darting around in the oppressive silence. The wind had died down, and the air was still, too still. It felt like they were standing at the edge of a precipice, the calm before a storm. "We have to find the car," Sarah whispered again, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, but before they could move, a low, groaning creak broke the silence. They both turned to see the door of a nearby house slowly swing open, as if beckoning them inside. "No way," Sarah breathed, shaking her head. "We're not going in there." But Ethan was already walking toward the door, his face a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Ethan, no," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "We need to leave. Now." But Ethan didn't stop. "Just a quick look," he muttered, his voice distant. "I just want to see." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she watched him step through the doorway and disappear into the darkness. The house felt alive. The floorboards creaked under Ethan's feet as if the building itself was reacting to his presence. The air was thick, stale, and smelled of damp wood and decay. He hesitated in the hallway, his hand shaking as he aimed his flashlight ahead. "Ethan!" Sarah's voice trembled from outside. "Please come back. Something's wrong." But Ethan couldn't resist. Something about the house drew him in, an invisible pull that urged him to keep going. He took a deep breath and pushed further inside, the beam of his flashlight sweeping over the peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The house had clearly been abandoned for years, yet it felt lived in. There were no signs of animals or squatters, no graffiti or signs of destruction. Instead, everything seemed to have been left in place, as if the occupants had simply vanished in the middle of their lives. A sudden creak echoed from upstairs. Ethan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned the flashlight toward the staircase, the beam illuminating the darkened steps. Something moved at the top, just out of sight, a shadowy figure shifting in the darkness. Ethan swallowed hard, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaking. There was no response, only the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps coming from above. Meanwhile, outside, Sarah stood frozen in terror. She could hear Ethan's voice faintly from inside the house, but the eerie silence that surrounded her made her skin crawl. She had to do something, anything. She couldn't just stand there while something terrible was happening inside. Summoning her courage, Sarah took a tentative step toward the house, her hands shaking. Just as she was about to cross the threshold, a cold gust of wind rushed past her, carrying with it a faint whisper. "Don't go in." Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was so faint, so distant, but it was unmistakable. It was a warning. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Something was horribly wrong with this place, and she needed to get Ethan out. Now. Ethan's heart raced as he crept up the stairs, the shuffling sounds growing louder. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. He could feel something watching him, following him with unseen eyes. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound made him jump, his nerves on edge. As he reached the top of the stairs, he turned the flashlight toward the end of the hallway. There, standing perfectly still in the doorway of one of the rooms, was the little girl. Her head was bowed, her hair obscuring her face, and her arms hung limply at her sides. The sight of her sent a cold chill down Ethan's spine. Something was deeply wrong about this child. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she lifted her head slowly, revealing a face twisted and contorted in a grotesque grin. Her eyes were black, hollow pits, and her mouth was stretched impossibly wide, as if her skin had been pulled taut over her skull. Ethan stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The girl began to move toward him, her movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet on strings. Sarah heard Ethan scream from inside the house and ran in without thinking. The oppressive atmosphere hit her like a wall, but she forced herself to push through it. She sprinted up the stairs, calling his name, but the house seemed to swallow her voice. At the top of the stairs, she found Ethan lying on the floor, unconscious but breathing. She shook him awake, her hands trembling. "Ethan, we need to go. Now." Ethan groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "The girl. The girl." "There's no girl," Sarah said, pulling him to his feet. "We're getting out of here." They stumbled down the stairs, the house groaning around them as if it were alive. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and darker. As they reached the front door, a voice echoed through the house, soft, distorted, and filled with malice. "You can't leave." The door slammed shut in front of them, the lock clicking into place. Sarah frantically tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Ethan, still dazed, stumbled toward the windows, but they were boarded up from the outside. The house wasn't going to let them leave. Panic surged through Sarah as the voice grew louder, echoing from every corner of the house. It was as if the very walls were speaking to them, whispering terrible things in a language she couldn't understand. "We need to find another way out," she gasped, her voice shaking. But before they could move, the ground beneath them began to shake. The walls trembled, the floorboards creaking and groaning as the house seemed to come alive. From the darkness, shadowy figures began to emerge, their eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. The figures surrounded them, their forms shifting and changing as they moved closer. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with fear. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was something far worse. The town, the buildings, the laughter, the little girl, they were all part of the same nightmare. Ethan, still weak from his encounter upstairs, leaned heavily on Sarah as they backed away from the encroaching shadows. "We're not getting out, are we?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah shook her head, her eyes scanning the room for any way out. The front door was locked, the windows were sealed, and the shadows were closing in fast. But then, in the corner of her eye, she saw it, a small, hidden door at the back of the room, half covered by debris. It was their only chance. "Come on," she whispered, pulling Ethan toward it. "We have to try." The door led to a narrow, winding staircase that descended deep into the earth. The air grew colder and thicker with each step, and the oppressive feeling only intensified. But they had no choice. They had to keep going. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, dimly lit room. At the center was a single object, a large, weathered book resting on a pedestal. The book. "It's the source," Ethan whispered, his eyes wide. Sarah stared at the book, her heart pounding. She didn't know how he knew that, but somehow she believed him. The book radiated an aura of malevolence, and she could feel its power coursing through the air. Without thinking, Sarah reached out and grabbed the book. The moment her fingers touched its surface, a blinding light filled the room. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into the air as the light consumed them. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The room was silent. The house was silent. The town was silent. Sarah and Ethan stood in the center of the room, the book still clutched in her hands, breathing heavily. The nightmare was over, but the town's dark secret remained. They had survived, but they would never forget. Sarah and Ethan managed to escape the town, but it was forever etched into their memories. They never spoke of it again, but the horrors they had witnessed haunted their dreams. The town remained, waiting for its next visitors, its dark secret buried deep within its decaying streets. And somewhere, in the shadows of the abandoned buildings, the laughter continued. The ghost town would never be forgotten.